Well, it's a bit of an unusual title, isn't it? The Way of the Slob. But it's a really good way, actually. You know, there's lots of ways that people talk about religion, maybe meditation, self improvement in some way. We're not talking about that. I'll get onto that shortly. We're talking about the Way of the Slob. Now, this is probably going to upset some people, which I'm very happy about. You possibly saw on the previous podcast I did, the one that I put up, the 5 Fools one. Somebody said, "Why do you always sound so depressed? Why can't you sound cheerful and happy?" So I just told them to fuck off, because I was in that kind of mood at the time. So some righteous prig who believes that everybody should obviously walk around with a smile on their face, and if you study psychology you know that smiles are not innocent things. Smiles are either a sign of acquiescing to someone to effectively try and win their approval, or it's a sign of dominance, showing the teeth. Anyway, that's another topic. I mean, there can just be smiles, but you know, very often it's not just a smile. So, the Way of the Slob. Now, the starting point in all of this is that slobs want pleasure. I want pleasure, you want pleasure, everybody you know wants pleasure. If they say that they don't want pleasure, they are lying. Even the masochist or the sadist is after pleasure through pain, admittedly. But if something is giving them pleasure, then it's not really pain, is it, for them? So this is the guiding principle in all of this. Now, if we want pleasure, then we need to find a way to gain it. In many religions, people, and let's just talk about religions and so-called spiritual stuff for a minute. The only driver for people to get involved in religions and so-called spiritual work and self-help and all the rest of it is the pursuit of pleasure. No one would go chasing some kind of spiritual practice or practicing some kind of religious thing if it wasn't going to deliver pleasure. They wouldn't do it if it was going to deliver pain. And even people who do things that in the short term deliver pain in some way do it with the expectation that eventually they will get pleasure. And so in various religions you see things like self-flagellation, contorted poses. In India there are guys who stick their arm up in the air and leave it there for 10 years. Well, after whatever how many weeks or months, the arm kind of ossifies. It's just stuck up there with big fingernails growing on it. Well, whatever gets you through the night. But they're after some kind of nirvana or some kind of realization. They're after pleasure. So this is what all spiritual and religious people are after, as well as people who do self-help and whatever. Or people who don't do anything, people who just do the 2.5 kids, nice house, car, good job, all that stuff. They're after pleasure. And that's what drives us all, and all animals as well. Now, there's a problem with that. And the problem is that life itself is not conducive to pleasure. What a bummer. We are driven in life through desire. And desire is pain. Desire is always a lack. It is painful. So, you want to drink. Normally there's water on hand or whatever. so you can go and get one, so the pain's not too intense. But what happens if there's a drought and there's no water anywhere around, or you're stuck in the middle of a desert? That little annoyance of being thirsty turns into full-blown agony. You die a horrible death. So desires are always painful. So this is a bit of a problem, isn't it, really? Because we can't really expect to live a pleasurable life if we're being pushed along by pain. So remember, all life is driven by desire. People in a certain age range procreate. They produce kids. It's driven by desire, the sexual desire. And if a man doesn't get sex, or a woman doesn't get sex for an extended period of time, it can be fairly unpleasant for them. So life itself isn't actually conducive to pleasure, and it was actually Schopenhauer who said that the greatest mistake that people make in life is the assumption that it should be pleasurable. So I'd like to make a suggestion, and this is central to the Way of the Slob. And actually, just before I go there, let me just talk about other ways, ones that are more contemporary. So, Buddhism has been sort of bastardized and imported into the West. And most of these ways that people are taught through contemporary gurus and what have you, always tell them the starting point is that in some way you are lacking. So maybe you are not present enough. Maybe you are not mindful enough. Maybe you are not in the now enough. Maybe you are not aware enough. These people have got to sell something, so they're going to make you feel as though you are deficient in some way. So, that too is a pain. Being told that you are deficient in some way diminishes your power, which is painful. If you've seen any of the other stuff we've done on Spinoza, you'll understand this in more depth, but basically that's the way it works. When we are diminished in some way, we experience pain. When we are enhanced in some way, we experience pleasure. The problem is that the whole damn thing is driven by pain, through desire. So, to get back to the Way of the Slob. The Way of the Slob understands life. That's the first thing. In the Way of the Slob, we understand the nature of life. We understand that we are driven by desire, and desires are painful. So, in the Way of the Slob, a person knows that pursuing desires is a recipe for pain, basically. And the slob understands that to artificially create desires, so most people do it, they see, let's say, a nice Mercedes somewhere in a magazine or whatever, and they want it. And there's a sense of lack, and that lack is a diminishing of power, and they feel deficient in some way until they get that nice Mercedes, and so they'll go and work in some shitty job, or suck some, or kiss some total bastard of a boss's ass for the next 2 years, just so they can get a nice car, which in turn is painful. So the slob understands that life itself operates from desire. Desires are painful, so that's not really a very good way to go. So in the Way of the slob makes very, very good friends with death and understands death, because death speaks to us all the time. It's just that we choose to ignore it. Death is always on hand. Some guy I know and have known for a while, died from a brain hemorrhage a few nights ago. Just went to bed normally, dead in the morning. And this is the way it works. And so if he'd been torturing himself with ambitions and desires, then that would have all been futile. But if he'd listened to death, he could have cut his life down to a minimum of desires and so on, and just pursued simple things that give, more or less immediate pleasures. So we listen to death. Death is not cruel. It's life that's cruel. Life fills us full of dreams and ambitions and desires, and things that generally will never be realized. And yet we will make huge efforts to try and achieve these things. And even things that people take for granted, like, let's play happy families. Happy families generally don't exist. It's just the myth that's perpetuated. Wealthy people being happy generally doesn't exist. There was a thing in the Financial Times many years ago now, actually, but I remember reading it. People who earned at that time over £150,000 a year, which I don't know, a couple $100,000, were more likely to be on tranquilizers or antidepressants. What do we do to ourselves? And this is life pushing people on. So we listen to death. Death says, I can call at any moment. It's quite honest. And this is a thing about life. Life is dishonest. We go chasing rainbows, mirages, thinking that over the next hill is a thing that will satisfy us. So life lies through its desires. But death is honest. Death says it can finish in an instant. So don't bother yourself, or don't get yourself too worked up over your ambitions and your desires. Because I'm being honest with you. I can finish it any moment. Be relaxed. Listen to me. Remind yourself of me. Because I'm speaking all the time in your subconscious, telling you that I can call at any moment. And if you try and ignore that voice, you'll become neurotic, as indeed most people are. Because they push those horrible, nasty thoughts into the back of their mind, and they just become neurotic. So death is honest, it's kind. It lets you off the hook from all these horrible desires and ambitions and drives that you might have that make you anxious, possibly depressed, give you no peace. And it's a constant friend, it's always there, whispering in your ears, I can call at any moment. So that's a central thing in the Way of the Slob, that we do not pursue life. We listen to death while in life. And that way you can lead a reasonably happy life without too much self-generated anxiety and ambitions that are probably never going to be realized, and the disappointments that come from that, and the pressure. So that's the fundamental first commandment, if you like, of the Way of the Slob. Listen to death, because it's whispering in your ear all the time. And what's more, if you become familiar with death, then you'll lose your fear of it to some extent. The body will always be afraid of death to some extent, but it's a matter of degree. So if you're familiar with it, and you know that, well, I might not make it through to the end of the day today, In fact, there's a very well-known Buddhist practice of just in the morning saying, I might not make it through to the end of the day today. And so you become less afraid because you're more familiar with death. So the way of the slob is a very, very nice way to live. And as someone commented actually on a little posting I did on Facebook, they said women don't like slobs. And that's very true. The research, and this can easily be interpreted as sexist. Well, it isn't, it's just the fucking research. Women prefer men that are resourceful and intelligent. End of story. So if you're a man pursuing the way of the slob, then there might be a price to pay. Although, you can lie and cheat. Life is mainly about lying, as you probably know. So you can present yourself as an industrious, productive man, get what you want, and then go back to being a slob. Yeah, I know I'm going to get some hassle for saying that, but that's the reality of it. So there you are, the way of the slob. Just drop all your ambitions, listen to death, all your desires, put them in context, and enjoy the day. Because the way of the slob is a way of gentleness, enjoyment, pleasure, and definitely not winding yourself up with endless ideas of what you're going to achieve and how you're going to schedule yourself and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, adopt the way of the slob. Drop all these methods and ideas that would have you being more mindful. As though you can be mindful. And the thing of being in the present, well, you're always in the fucking present, whether you want to be or not. And if you're daydreaming about something that's happened, I don't know, 5 years ago, you're daydreaming about that in the present. You can't help but be in the present. So anyway, I hope somebody, at least who listens to this, will adopt the way of the slob.